Welcome to today's webinar, Pandemic Response, Addressing the Mental Health and Counseling Needs of Students. My name is David Nash. I'm the director of the Legal One program. We are very happy to be offering today's webinar in partnership with the New Jersey School Counselors Association. In a moment, I'll introduce our presenters. I do want to stress as we get ourselves started that we are providing you with a number of resource materials that we will only be briefly referencing today, but you're going to have a link built into a PowerPoint that you'll be receiving that has extensive resource materials to support our presentation today. Let me just take a moment to first introduce Jim Lukach. Jim is the Executive Director for the New Jersey School Counselors Association. And Jim, thank you so much for partnering with us on today's webinar.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to work with you guys. On behalf of the New Jersey School Counselors Association, I'd like to extend a very special welcome to all of the participants out there and the attendees. We appreciate your time and your effort getting together and being part of this. As you see the presenters, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank them for the time they have put in putting their presentations together. I think everyone is going to find the presentation extremely informative and very useful. With that, I just want to continue to thank them for their time and putting their presentation together and being here with us this afternoon. For additional resources, please go to www.njsca.org, which is the website for the New Jersey School Counselors Association. We have lots of resources listed and lots of information for school counselors. So without further ado, please enjoy the presentations. Back to David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's just been wonderful partnering with you over the last many years. We've worked together on so many presentations. So we really appreciate the efforts to work closely with us. Let me welcome Sue Coyle. Sue is the Middlesex County Coordinator for the Traumatic Loss Coalition and has been a great partner at helping us develop our trainings related to addressing student mental health issues. So Sue, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank all of the attendees for coming out for this really important topic.
Also, thank you very much. Thank you, Tim Conway. Tim is Director of School Counseling for Lakeland Regional High School, past President of the New Jersey School Counselors Association, and has just done an incredible job at putting together protocols in his district that I think we'll all benefit from today. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here. Hope this information is helpful for everyone and any way we can help.
And of course, Rebecca Gold. Rebecca is with us for virtually all of our webinars and has been a great partner in so much of our training and is Interim Director of Human Resources currently in the Hamilton School District. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you, and thank all of you for everything you're doing and the important work that's getting done. Thank you all.
So, of course, as folks are listening today, we are trying to give you the very latest information to help you address this difficult time. We are not giving you legal advice as we go through our presentation today, but we are giving you really important information to take back and have critical follow-up discussions in your district, including potentially discussions with your school attorney. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing series. We know that in the field, you need as much support as possible to deal with this difficult time. So we have developed this series of webinars to help you in your roles in our schools. And we give you links here to webinars that we have offered over the last several weeks. And we want to just remind you and give you a link as well to an upcoming webinar that we're offering this Wednesday on addressing FERPA and student confidentiality, which will build on the discussion that we're having today for those who want to deep dive into the issues of student confidentiality and FERPA. So we encourage you to sign up for that free webinar as well. And the date has been moving, but we are still tentatively planning to do a webinar in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education to walk through guidance that we hope will be released this week on observation and evaluation. So we now have that webinar tentatively scheduled for this Thursday, April 9th. And a reminder for folks who are anxious to have the materials from today's session, we will be sending out an email tomorrow that includes your certificate for having participated in today's webinar and a link to today's PowerPoint, which in turn builds in links to all of the resource materials that we're referencing. So you will be getting that within the next day. Just to provide an overview of the topics that we're going to be walking through. In a moment, Sue Coyle will talk about the tremendous mental health impact that we are all struggling with. We are in unprecedented times, struggling together to work through this pandemic, to work through the school closure, to make sure that we are supporting each other. And it's important as we start today to understand the potential impact of what we're going through and some practical steps to deal with that. I will then walk through legal obligations related to mental health and counseling that are in effect as we speak. Tim Conway will then walk through a number of best practice considerations for providing services and protocols that we should think through and samples of different types of approaches that we can think about taking. Sue Coyle will then walk through adapting our crisis response plans to deal with our current situation and make sure that no student falls through the cracks. And we'll give you information about a future series that we're offering in conjunction with New Jersey PTA on ways to engage our families and how critical it is that we be partners in addressing our challenges. So just a brief moment on where we are today. We know we had a statewide closure as of March 20th. We don't know. Part of our challenge is we just don't know when schools will reopen, or frankly, if schools will reopen this school year. Based on the latest numbers I saw, we are approaching 40,000 cases that are confirmed in New Jersey of the coronavirus and 1,000 deaths just in New Jersey. Obviously, this has had a huge societal impact, tremendous economic upheaval that impacts so many of our families. But we're also seeing so many people across our state and our country who are seizing the opportunity to find new ways to connect, to support each other. And it's been incredibly inspiring to see so much of that happening. So let me turn over to Sue Coyle for us to talk a little bit about the impact of where we are today.
Thanks, David. So it's not hard to teach about the impact of COVID on our mental health because collectively we're all experts at it now. Just a short time ago, most of us felt in control, safe, and that the world's an okay place. And just like with 9/11, now we all remember that defining day or moment when it hit us that everything had changed. So,
Let me go back. I'm sorry, Sue.
I'm sorry. Nope, I just lost my place.
So of course this.
I'm sorry. My computer just went a little wonky on me. So part of the stress of and trauma of doing a webinar.
Yes.
So you know, there's evidence of this pandemic's impact on us all is evident in a multitude of symptoms, you know, such as these. A good friend of mine remarked, "It's unbelievable to live in a world now where everyone has anxiety." She also pointed out to me that my anxiety about making this presentation just perfect was my way of trying to take back some of that control. So kids are feeling it too. David, you can move on for me, thanks. The loss of routines, being with friends, new ways of doing school, navigating content, navigating constant togetherness, unsure of expectations in this new and changing normal, and a real important thing that I'm hearing and talking with a lot of young people is about the loss of milestones like graduations and proms and getting ready for college. Okay, David. Hello.
Hi. So I did move us to symptoms that we see in kids.
That's what I was just talking about. Okay. You can move to the next slide, self-care and coping. So some of the things that we really need to be focusing on now is modifying daily activities, especially to meet the current reality and focus on things that you can accomplish. Focusing more on what gives you meaning, purpose, or what you find fulfilling. Doing things that will give you small breaks from the stress of the situation. And role modeling for kids. How can we handle, how we handle stress affects them and informs them. Basic mindfulness practices such as focusing breathing exercises. Research has shown that these kind of practices have very beneficial effects on our neurobiology, and that can help us cope. I'm sorry, lost my place again, David.
It's okay.
And so what kids need from us is help with adjusting to new or changing routines, and not just from brick and mortar school to school, but often things might be changing even the way we're rolling out distance learning to kids as we're learning new things. Important piece is limiting intake of news, keeping kids in the loop in whatever way is age appropriate, giving them information and keeping them in the loop about what's going on in the world as well as what's going on with their schooling. And finding ways to include them in making plans and solve some of the new problems that are arising out of this new way of being and having to stay in place. And most importantly, providing reasonable and flexible expectations for kids. I love this quote that I came across recently about adopting this rule: take the path of least resistance. We hold our kids to very high standards now, you know, and sometimes, you know, there's ways we can still accomplish what needs to be accomplished without overstressing them. So, you can use this graphic as a great springboard for personalizing your own ideas about ways to regain a feeling of control. And you can also use this as a way of working with your students or your own kids, you know, have them create their own graphic and personalize it. And it's no wonder that our parks and neighborhoods are filled with walkers. It's just not boredom that's sending people outside. You know, our instincts are telling us that this is good for us. 30 years worth of studies have shown that just 10 to 20 minutes in nature, only 2 or 3 times a week, can reduce stress levels and positively impact our mental health. So as we listen expectantly for news of treatments, cure, a vaccine, one thing that we can be sure of, there is research-based evidence about the healing powers of connections. So one anecdote that we can count on right now is social connections. And in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. So what I've seen in my 40 years as an educator and mental health professional, I've seen remarkably good things come out of the ashes of a crisis. We now have an incredible opportunity to foster the amazing empathy, kindness, and giving we're witnessing, and to harness it, and to create a generation of incredibly resilient kids. I'm reminded of this every day during my daily run as I read through these simple, heartfelt messages from the kids in my neighborhood in their sidewalk art. You can move through that, David.
Great images.
Great images. And so I will leave you with this. In the rush to return to normal, let us use this time to consider which things of normal are worth rushing back to, and consider what new lessons we have learned about resiliency, and more importantly, about how to help our kids build theirs.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's really important for us to take time to ask that fundamental question. And maybe we can look at having this be a transformative moment in some positive ways as well, as we kind of reflect on what really matters. So, of course, as we're thinking through how to support our students, we have to make sure that we are aware of our overall legal obligations. Many of you who are on this webinar are school counselors, social workers, psychologists, school administrators, and others in the school setting, of course, parents. So many of you are parents as well. For our school officials, we have a fundamental set of duties, the duty to supervise kids, which still exists even in this virtual world, a duty to protect from foreseeable dangers. And we sort of feel in some ways like we have so many unforeseeable dangers, but we know that there are certain things that we should be proactively addressing. The duty to report imminent dangers that we become aware of that a student may be facing. Our duty to continue to provide ongoing services. School is in session. Doesn't feel like it. We know that we are in this huge upheaval, but virtually school is in session. And we need to continue to provide the essential services that we have been providing. And of course, that's challenging. We have to do that in a way that also does everything appropriate to protect student privacy. So the duty of care, one of the things that we always have to think about with the duty of care is, did we know or should we have known that a student was facing potential harm? This is a famous case, LW versus Toms River, where the New Jersey Supreme Court made clear for all school districts that the obligation isn't just when somebody comes to you and directly says, I'm in trouble, I need your help. It's when there are enough signs out there that we should be proactively realizing that this student needs help and taking the steps we need to take to support that student. We know that there is no greater obligation than to protect our kids, than to keep them safe, whether we're protecting them from intentional acts or careless acts of others. So we have an obligation to affirmatively support our students, and that obligation extends to this period of remote instruction. It extends to conduct away from school grounds, which is not a new concept. We have a case that goes back to 1970 that made very clear that we have an obligation to address potential harms that are happening to kids away from school if it's going to impact their ability to learn, their ability to fully participate in the school environment. So the duty of care during closure is something we have to think very closely about. For example, if we have a student who is just non-responsive, is not completing any work, we know that our teachers have a wide array of strategies they're using to keep kids engaged, to give them work to do, to make sure that they are continuing their education. But if students don't respond at all, that's a red flag. It's a red flag that a student may need support, may need ongoing counseling support, may need us to be proactive in reaching out. Student has verbal or electronic communication with a teacher, a counselor, other school staff that gives notice of a possible issue, even though we know in many cases kids are not very specific. It's a leap of faith for a child to protect an adult or to trust an adult, and they might not give you all the information you need right away. But when we see something that tells us this child is struggling, we have to pay attention to the clues and follow up. Of course, the information can come directly from a parent. We have to make sure that parents know how to reach us, how to communicate their concerns regarding their child, to ask for help, to ask for our efforts together to support their kids who may be struggling at this time. Other students or staff could learn of an issue on social media. We know even in the best of circumstances, kids will sometimes make bad choices on social media Right now, there is just a huge increase in the amount of time that students and staff members are spending on social media, and we might see issues of concern. And we know some kids who have already been identified as at-risk students who we already had on our radar screen, where we should not be sitting back, but we should be proactively making sure we're addressing those kids. For example, our transgender student population is at a risk of suicidal ideation in the best of circumstances that is 6 or 7 times higher than the general population. So those kids who we know who are in that particular subgroup, we should be proactively reaching out at this time, making sure they are supported. Kids who have been bullied recently, kids who we know have underlying mental health issues or struggling with drug or alcohol issues. It's time for us to make sure that we don't have any kids falling through the cracks. We are proactively reaching out. And there are so many legal requirements that are in full force and effect. I mean, these are meant to protect our kids. The Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights is in full effect. Many of our school counselors are anti-bullying specialists, as are our social workers and school psychologists. And the legal obligations inherent in the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights are still in effect. The New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, IDEA, Section 504. We have other anti-discrimination laws, other laws designed to protect safety. So, for example, if we think a student might be under the influence of alcohol or a controlled dangerous substance, and those signs might come in some way through virtual interactions with the student, and other requirements where we do have to report to law enforcement that we need to understand. And of course, we also still have to think about addressing all of those imminent issues and protecting student privacy. So this is not new, right? The duty to report, whether it's suspected child abuse or neglect, somebody potentially being under the influence, bullying, other code of conduct issues. I'll walk through in a moment issues of reporting to law enforcement, issues that require us to address a student with a disability, other foreseeable harms. So we know these duties. It's not a surprise that we have these duties, but we have to adapt our protocols to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks as we're dealing with the difficult time that we're in right now. So the child abuse and neglect reporting protocol is something that we have all had to come to learn and become comfortable with. Now we have to adapt that to the remote environment, and there is no time for delay. Let's face it, teacher is interacting with a student and it's a live interaction, or a counselor is interacting with a student and it's a live interaction. You might see something very concerning in that moment that could potentially trigger that requirement to report potential abuse or neglect. And we have to pay attention to those signs that we might see that would trigger that immediate report. Every staff member needs to understand that. Teachers need to understand that. Anybody else who is interacting with our kids needs to understand that these obligations are in effect as we speak. If we actually think a child is being abused or neglected, there is no time to lose. So it's important that we make sure that we have adapted our protocol on reporting potential abuse and neglect. We have many other areas of mandated reports to law enforcement. We get some information that has us suspecting a student is in possession of illegal substances, distributing those substances. We have our obligations to report to law enforcement. Unlawful possession of a firearm or other deadly weapon. If we see a credible threat of either death or serious or significant bodily injury, I will stress that credibility is a determination that the school district's allowed to make. But if you see a situation that is a close call and somebody might be in danger, obviously we want to err on the side of reporting. Crimes involving sexual penetration that could be occurring during school hours, we know we have to report to law enforcement. And bias-related acts. We become aware of a potential bias-related act that requires us to report that information to law enforcement as well as doing our bullying investigation. And about half of our HIB cases meet the criteria for a bias-related act because it involves a protected class under state or federal anti-discrimination law. We do have a duty to continue to provide services, even as challenging as that is. So you want to ask yourself the fundamental question: what services would I be providing in my role? Whether I'm a counselor, social worker, psychologist, teacher, school administrator, what would I be doing to support kids? And how can I adapt to our current situation? What can I do to make sure that in as seamless a way as possible, we continue to provide those services to students? So you have to think through students who we were already serving prior to closure. You're a counselor and you have been seeing a student on a regular basis, and you had plans to continue to see that student on a regular basis, and then we had this closure. We don't want to have those services stop. Newly identified students who, if we were in school and operating in a normal fashion, we would be setting up time to meet with that student. We need to figure out a way to still do that. Proactive outreach, as I said, to students that we know are at risk, even if we haven't seen a direct sign in this moment about that student. But we know it's a student who struggled with various issues. We want to make sure we don't lose that. And we know that there are pre-planned services, things that happen every spring. So for our school counselors, we want to think about what would we have been doing in the spring. For example, for our high school students, thinking about transitions where they might be moving on to college, moving on to the workplace, providing that kind of counseling. For students with disabilities, transitions and support for them as well. So we want to make sure that those things that we would have been doing in the spring, we think through, can we still find a way to do this to support our kids? And we know the state of New Jersey has clarified some issues where there were concerns. So on April 1st, the State Board of Education adopted an emergency rule that makes it clear that we can provide virtual remote services to students with disabilities, and that will not be a violation of state law or state regulation. The U.S. Department of Education had previously sent out guidance stressing that it was absolutely permissible to provide online services for students with disabilities under IDEA. And New Jersey has now helped to clarify that even further by adopting that emergency regulation. We know that there is case law predating the situation that we're in right now, but case law that tells us that our courts place a great emphasis on supporting students' social and emotional learning. So I give you examples of a couple of cases here where our courts found that districts needed to pay as much attention to social and emotional learning as we're paying to academics. And that's true for students with disabilities, but it's true more broadly for all of our students. So as we think about all those duties, of course, we also have a duty to protect privacy. And districts are struggling with this, struggling with balancing that need to protect privacy, provide ongoing services, and ensure that the provision of services is equitable, because not everybody has the same access to technology. So social and emotional learning is an essential component of FATE for students with disabilities. Remote instruction can facilitate social interaction and help us ensure the least restrictive environment. There is no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to engaging our kids. The U.S. Department of Education has put out guidance as recently as this past month, and we include links to that guidance that make clear that FERPA does not prevent us from remotely interacting with our students, whether it is instructional services or counseling services. We do know, though, that counseling does potentially involve the sharing of very sensitive information, so we have to think through those challenges. So part of the guidance that came out in March of this year made clear that for teachers, if we had somebody else who happened to be in the home and happened to be able to observe a virtual lesson that was going on, that it would not in any way violate FERPA for another staff or for another member of the family to be observing that virtual in-person lesson. And, you know, that would be true for a virtual counseling session as well. Now, there are all sorts of reasons we want to have privacy in our counseling sessions, and we'll talk about that and talk about best practices. But there is no impediment in FERPA for us to be providing those virtual services, even if somebody in the home might be able to see other students in perhaps a group counseling session. So FERPA neither requires nor prohibits individuals from observing a classroom or observing a delivery of virtual services. We have a letter that was sent way back in 2003 that the U.S. Department of Ed has said is equally applicable today, that talks about allowing others to observe our interactions with kids. However, while we do that, we have to try ourselves not to be revealing personal, private information from the student record. And we have to try to do everything possible to protect the privacy of those conversations. So we will talk more about that. We wanted to give you some important resources when it comes to privacy issues. So we are, as I mentioned, doing another webinar on Wednesday this week, April 8th, where we will do a deep dive into these resources on privacy. But we give you the links here. If you are using various educational platforms, you're using various apps, very important that that happen through approved district channels, and we make sure that the vendors involved with those platforms, with those applications, are not violating their obligation to protect student privacy. So we give you here some important links. Your district should be making sure that you're following these requirements and best practices with any vendors that you are using to engage with your students. Some other legal considerations. There is no need for prior parent permission in order to provide counseling services to a student. So if a student was going to a biology class, we wouldn't need prior parent permission for that biology teacher to interact with that student. New Jersey has adopted social and emotional learning standards. So the work that you are doing, so many of you as school counselors, is helping to meet the New Jersey standards that we have for our students. And you have the right to do that, to address those social and emotional learning needs, to address academic and career counseling needs, to address for our SACs and others who are part of the comprehensive drug and alcohol program, supporting students to address those needs as well. However, we do have to recognize that sessions in many cases, even though we would like them to be private, may not always be private, and we have to acknowledge that that could undermine the effectiveness of those sessions. So it's incredibly important that we talk with our parents about the value of respecting their child's ability to have that private session, to try to get parents to recognize the importance of that and to allow those private interactions to still occur. It's important to consider parent notice so that parents understand the services that we're providing, but I would not call that active consent, because what happens to when we have a student who needs our support, needs our help, and the parent has not consented? Do we deny that support, deny those services for that child? Of course not. So we want to think about making sure parents are informed of the services that we have rather than calling that active consent. We do have to recognize that if a recording exists of any interaction that we're having with a student, that now is going to become part of the student record. The parent will have a right to see that video. It may be that there are times where you would still like to have that video. That should go through your school district channels, but recognize that when you have recorded an interaction, you are creating a student record that is subject to FERPA. We also have to be aware of potential discrimination claims that could occur if we are denying access to services for students based on disability, race, ethnicity, or other protected class. So if we have active consent, it is fairly likely that that would have a disproportionate negative impact on the delivery of services for students in one or more protected classes, potentially race, ethnicity, disability. We want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to equally serve all of our students. And it's important that we take those steps to provide that ongoing support. We also are seeing new forms of bullying. So we give you a link here to an article where we have new forms of bullying that are related to coronavirus. Students, for example, being singled out for being Asian American, and horrible terms like Chinese virus being used. We have CDC warnings that have been put out about the efforts we need to make to reduce stigmatizing of individuals linked to coronavirus. And that stigma could even come just from anyone, any student who perhaps others know has tested positive and is now being stigmatized for that. So it's important that we be proactive in supporting those students. I mentioned the bias-related act definition. We see it here. If we learn about a student being singled out because of race, color, national origin, ethnicity, gender identity expression, disability, religion, or sexual orientation, we do have a requirement to not only address that as a potential bullying issue, we also have a requirement to report that to local and county law enforcement. We also know that as we work very hard to protect student confidentiality, there are certain things that must be reported. So I give you here one example of a case where we had a counselor in SAC who had actually recorded an interview with a student who turns out was sexually abused and did not turn that over to an investigating agency. In that case, tenure charges for conduct unbecoming and insubordination were sustained against that particular individual. So while we do everything possible to protect student confidentiality where appropriate, we know there are imminent harm issues that must be reported and shared with appropriate authorities. So that was a quick review of some important legal considerations. Let me just take a moment to see if we have questions at this point, Rebecca.
Yes, we have questions. First one is, what are school grounds in a virtual world?
So what are school grounds in a virtual world? Unfortunately, the student is at home, and that is now part of the school environment.
Okay. We have another one follow up to that. If a student is in a class, online class, and is under the influence, and the student posted that he was under the influence on the chat room, what is the protocols for under the influence? Is it the same to require sending him out? How is that handled?
So if we have reason to believe that a student during a school day is under the influence, we now have a specific reason to believe that student could be in danger. We have a requirement to make sure that we address the imminent danger that student is in, and that would invoke the obligation to have the student receive an immediate medical examination. So it's possible, and in a vast majority of cases, I guess you would have a parent or some other adult who might be in that home. I'm not sure what percentage of cases, but if that adult is able to act to make sure that the student is seen and does get a medical examination, that would satisfy the requirement. If you're able to gather some additional information, and even though you had a social media post, you can see the student and see that the student is not under the influence, you wouldn't have to invoke the immediate medical examination requirement. We do have to recognize the challenging environment we're in right now. We have that immediate medical examination requirement. It may be extremely difficult for the parent to be able to get a child for that immediate medical examination at this point. So I would say due diligence and gathering the information to see if there is imminent danger. If we see that imminent danger, then you might be in a situation where we have to call for an ambulance to come to that facility. We have to contact law enforcement that a student could be in imminent danger. So a little more information gathering, but we might have to follow that protocol.
Okay, and the last one's a quick yes and no. Can you just repeat if we can conduct group treatment sessions?
You can conduct those sessions. You have to be aware as you're conducting the group sessions that you don't want the counselor to be revealing personally identifiable information about particular students. And you want to try to set the ground rules for those group sessions so that students are not volunteering information about each other during that session. So it's important to set appropriate expectations. Under FERPA, you can do that sort of a counseling session, but you want to make sure you set the ground rules first.
Thanks. I'll hold some of the other ones for the end since I'm watching the time here.
Great. So Tim, why don't you take over and we'll talk about some guidelines for virtual counseling.
Thanks, Dave. And no pressure now with the time thing, but I'll try to stay on track here.
Okay.
So with my section, my goal is really to try to give you some best practices, what's recommended for virtual counseling that's being recommended in the field. If you were to have gone through some training, as well as some ideas on how you can practice this in your districts. So I think the biggest thing within any district with any school counselor right now, I think even some of the questions that you heard is fear of the unknown. Dave, if you could just go to the next slide. I think people are afraid. There's 73.8%. A little survey that I did across the state with the directors have said that they're apprehensive. They feel like they can't do virtual counseling. Can you do virtual counseling? The short answer is yes. You are trained to be a school counselor, to do counseling. You've gotten the mental health training. Really, the only thing that's a little bit different is the medium. It's not in person. It is now in a virtual environment, which I know some people are very apprehensive about, all the what ifs. But just like when you first started out as a counselor, all those what ifs existed as well. So it's, are you able to? Yes. Are you insured to do so? You're covered under your school's insurance, if you will, your held harmless agreement. However, if you have other insurance through NJSCA, which is the American School Counseling Association, or the American Counseling Association, ACA, their subsidiary is HPSO. Both of those organizations, if you look on their website, your coverage does cover virtual school counseling. So Dave, if you can go on. Are you legally able to conduct? Yes. Again, you're operating within your certification. I'll talk a little bit about that more when we get to area talking about jurisdiction and where the student actually is. In your code of ethics as school counselors, the American School Counseling Association 4th edition, that came out last summer, and it's in the resources section of this presentation, does have a whole section on virtual counseling, and you are able to conduct virtual counseling. The core key part here is, have you received training on providing virtual counseling? Now, nationally, back in 2017, this number was at 79% who felt like they had not received training. In New Jersey, again, an evolving poll that I've started about a week or so ago, 63.7% of school counselors have not received professional development in distance or virtual counseling. So as one of the core components, and Dave, you can go on to the next slide, it's one of the core components, these are the things that are what you really will need to do virtual counseling. You do need training. So districts, if there are administrators that are on the line, or directors, supervisors of school counseling, there should be some kind of training that should be taking place. There were some free distance counseling trainings that were going on around the state. I was passing those around to those people who are in the groups I circle with. I'm not sure if they still are free, but some of the organizational resources I have towards the end of this presentation also will refer you to those two sites where you can get some additional training. It can be done virtually. They can be done very quickly. I did 3 yesterday in like 2 or 3 hours just because I felt like it. Don't judge. Yeah, so some training. In New Jersey, there are no guidelines, requirements of having virtual counseling training. So when that happens, it is recommended that you follow your code of ethics, which also just mentions training in a very broad and vague sense. So you just need some training to get a better sense, but training, you already have the skills and the other pieces of the puzzle. So we talked a little bit about training. You just need to get some form of training. The more the better, but some. You want to abide by your code of ethics. You want to verify the jurisdiction of the student you're counseling each session. And the reason that you want to do that is because if the student is in, hopefully this isn't the case, but they're in New York State and you're in New Jersey, you're certified as a school counselor in New Jersey, not in New York. Even though there's reciprocity, we won't even go into there. You don't have a certification to operate outside the state. So make sure you know exactly where the student is during each session. Abide by the laws, again, where the person resides, and you want to display your professional credentials. We'll talk more about this, but there's an informed notification that you can send out to parents and students. I have a sample one in this presentation, but within there, you should also probably notify them of your credentials. Dave, next slide. We talked about the provider side of this, but in terms of suitability for students, you want to take into consideration the cognitive ability of the student to do online counseling. Now, we're in a situation where you can't refer them to anywhere else because there really isn't anywhere else. So if you do have students that are in need of assistance, you have to kind of weigh that piece of the puzzle there. But their cognitive ability, do they have the competence, the technical competence to go through any sort of virtual counseling? You know, do they know how to connect through Google Meet or Zoom or any of these other providers? Do they have the required internet bandwidth? Are they a homeless student that doesn't have access? How will you accommodate those students who don't have the access through their bandwidth or Wi-Fi or what have you? And are they willing to provide those services with you? So those are some things to keep in mind. Services under normal circumstances, you're doing this stuff on a normal day-to-day basis. So you want to keep that in mind. You've already got the training to do this. You just trying to adapt your procedures and your policies for an online platform. There are benefits and limitations, and these are things that you should put in your informed notifications. Again, I have a sample that's out there that I'll share, but what do you do in the event of technology failure? Is there an alternative method of communication, such as a phone number or an email or whatever? How will you connect with the student in the event of technology failure? And you also want to make sure that you're notifying to students and parents about confidentiality. That's your bread and butter, but what happens in the event that you're on one of these online platforms? A lot going around about Zoom right now, but what are the confidentiality restrictions? What can you guarantee or not of the student's confidentiality in an online platform? Next slide, Dave. So challenges and limitations, we've talked or we'll talk more about these, a lot of these, but the one I really wanted to focus on this particular slide is evasiveness. I know that this has been a challenge. Each week it kind of evolves a little bit too, but you have some students or some parents, or both in some cases, who are not responding in any way, shape, or form. Virtual can be intimidating to students at first if they don't want to do the virtual, like the video-based counseling. Perhaps start out non-confrontationally in email. I know some districts are even using text. There is some research to support that. If you start in like text and email, or even work your way up through phone, up to video conferencing, you help them to become more familiar and acclimated to the technology itself, and then they may be more willing to utilize it. So I would say those are some things to keep in consideration. And worst case, you can always enlist the parental support. I will say, Dave, I'll try not to take too much time here, but I will say if you really get into a bind where students and parents are not responding, you could always reach out, like Dave said, to DCPMP. Could be a situation of abuse or neglect. And if you really have a concern for a student about one of those things, you do have to make sure that you're reporting those to the appropriate people. Best practices, we're in this particular section, how to communicate between sessions. You just want to have some sort of whatever that means is that you're agreeing on with your district. In my informed notification, my counselors are using video sessions, email, as well as phone. So how you will connect with the students in between sessions, how they will arrange for meetings. You can use things like Google Appointments, Calendly, different ways to set up appointments. You want to inform the clients of making sure that they're being protected. So and I'm trying to make sure that, thank you, Dave, you don't want them to share their login or information, don't record sessions, try not to have someone in the room, making sure that you're identifying that you know the identity of the person on the other line. If you know the student, you can identify them visually, great. If not, then you got to make sure that you have some sort of verification process. Next slide, Dave. Just like I said before, verify and document. Can't practice where you're not certified. You have to make sure you know when you're going to have to refer to someone else if you don't have the necessary skills or you're concerned. When in doubt, the best rule of thumb is always to consult. If you're concerned about a particular student case or not sure what to do, or you get an email or phone call or see something, talk to somebody else, talk to another counselor, talk to a supervisor or administrator. Consultation is your best form of legal protection to try to do the best, what's in the best interest for the student. Go on to the next slide, Dave. You always want to verify the client's psychological safety. Are they in a good place? Again, you want to make sure that you're respecting, like Dave said, their confidentiality, who's around. what are the boundaries of the virtual sort of a platform? They shouldn't be sharing a link with another student, and there's things like that. If you're paying attention to Zoom right now, you want to make sure that you're using some sort of a link to password protect, or enable a waiting room where you invite in the person while they're waiting to come into your virtual chat. Again, different safeguards you can put in place to make sure it's just you and the student, or you and a group of students, and you're trying to, as much as possible, respect their confidentiality. There is a link here, so when you do get this presentation, you'll have the opportunity to utilize, feel free to use it or adapt it, a sample set of guidelines for having individual or group sessions with students. Next slide, Dave. Again, verification, client's age, the client's identity, just making sure that you know who it is that you are talking to. And there's reasons for that too. It's not just say, oh, I'm talking to X student. You want to make sure for in case of an emergency that you're getting the right information to the right student and the right people. So in the event that there is an emergency, you should have the local police department phone numbers readily available. And you should also have, and that's the police departments as well as EMS. And the reason is, if you now in a virtual environment live in one town and the student lives in another, if you call 911, it will go to your town, not the student's town, in terms of referring services, and it will just waste more time trying to get connected. With the students, Dave, could go back for 1 second, I'm sorry. Parental consent, you don't need a consent, you do need a notification. So again, using some notification methods. And you could have something with the student through the school email, like a code word or some way to connect to make sure you know who it is you're talking to. Next slide. In an emergency situation, you do want to make sure you utilize your school's written procedure. So you should already have one. However, again, to those counselors and administrators in the room, you want to make sure that you've adapted this to a virtual platform, because it is going to be slightly different. What's going to happen in terms of a technology failure? What's going to happen if you get an email at 11 o'clock at night outside those normal school hours, to a teacher, and 8 o'clock in the morning you see that the student was contemplating suicide? What do you do? Who do you contact? Those are things that you really need to look at your school's protocol procedures and adapt them to a virtual environment. You do want to have, again, those emergency contacts on hand. You should likely have access to the student's information system from home, so you have an adult emergency contact, and again, in the events of some emergency like that, local police and EMT, you should have those on hand at home, so that way you're not scrambling trying to find them in the event of an emergency. Next slide, Dave. So when trying to create this type of a protocol, you should, I'd say this is a recommendation. A recommendation could be to have a designated responder, so a singular person at your school that could be the point of contact during normal business hours. The person's mobile cell phone number, including what times that person is available, should be put out to staff, along with what the procedure would be. Also, in the event that that does happen, is what happens when it is outside the normal business hours. What should you be doing? And your district should really come up with some sort of a virtual protocol that should go out to staff that would be helpful in this situation with those appropriate phone numbers, so that way everybody knows what to do in the case of an emergency and you're not scrambling in the moment. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. There's a lot that can go through in terms of technology compliance, and I know Dave said he'll talk a little bit more about this on Wednesday, but these are just some things to think about for your district as you're contemplating technology and whether it's appropriate. If you're looking at HIPAA compliance, which is like the highest level standard, we're not required to as a FERPA entity, but those associations that are required to use HIPAA are using something called a Business Associate Agreement, a BAA. You may want to look into those into your district to try to create additional safeguards for your students in terms of respecting their confidentiality and their privacy of their student records. Data in transit and at rest, I'm not going to go through those because of just unfortunately the sake of time, but basically transit is like what happens when you send it from your computer to another computer, and the video data at rest is where is the data being stored or backed up to, and those are some things that you should take into consideration as you evaluate a provider and whether or not it is appropriate for what you're going to be doing. Next slide, please. Okay, informed notification. These are two samples here. One is my standard one. One is one I adapted for a virtual environment. These will be available to you. Feel free to utilize, make a copy, use verbatim, tweak to your district, however your pleasure. One thing, or the things that you should be taking into consideration, are the boundaries, and I think this is important. You should be setting some sort of a boundary for your district, because you don't want the impression to be that you're available 24/7. That wouldn't be realistic or fair. So you do want to set boundaries. What are your normal business hours? You should list those. When will counselors be available, and how should students and parents reach out to them? When will they respond in the event that it's after hours? What are community resources and contacts that the student or parent should use in the event of an emergency outside normal business hours? So benefits and limitations, all of those things should be listed in there, so that way it would answer most of the questions that might come up, as well as, again, setting the expectation, those important boundaries. These are two resources that you can feel free to take a look at. The National Board for Certified Counselors, NBCC. These are two approved training providers for providing virtual counseling. Both of them have a 9-part series. Each of them run about an hour each, pretty reasonable in terms of cost. I've actually been trying to see for New Jersey if we can get them to reduce a cost from a state perspective, and I'll let you know if I have any luck there. It seems like I've got some, and hopefully we'll have some more, but that could be an area where you can refer your counselors for some additional training on virtual counseling. So different ways that you can connect to students and parents, these are evolving. So video conferencing is probably the most popular. Zoom is very popular right now, and I won't lie, I love it too. It's really great, have had no issues with it in terms of crashing. However, there's a lot of concerns in the news, so you want to be aware of those. Some of the big issues with Zoom are about where they were storing their data, who had access in terms of reselling the data to the students, probably because there was not a BAA, Business Associate Agreement, in place about who they could or couldn't share the information with. The privacy settings, making sure that you have things like a wait room, that you are admitting in the students into your waiting room. So again, there's different ways. They just had their default settings on. You want to just be mindful of those things for your video platform. But Zoom, Google Meet, FaceTime, those are all some samples. I know other districts are using DoxyMe and a bunch of others, which I'll go through momentarily. You can use audio conference only, or you could use phone call. You could use email. I know some districts are using text messaging. We use Google Appointments if a student or parent wants to set up an appointment with us. So if you're trying to save time, or how students and parents can set up a time to meet with you, that's a way to do that. Google Appointments, Calendly, there's other softwares out there. Those are just a few. My staff were concerned about getting their information out there about their cell phones and their private numbers. You could use *67 or create your own Google Voice account, another method of trying to keep your information safe but still reach out to students and parents. These are just some examples of things that you can do from home. These are, again, just some examples. I'm not going to go through them. You can look at those on your own, but lots of ways to still connect with students. You can use Google Forms and surveys. Again, these links are hyperlinked with some samples. Some of our directors, supervisors are already utilizing. So things like morning check-ins, a mood check-in, appointment request forms like through Google Appointments, general surveys to student and parents to find out what are the issues and themes of things that they're addressing. As a school counselor, you should be advocating for your students. So if you're seeing things and recurring things happening for certain students, like a student with disabilities who really needs a paper version, or a homeless student who doesn't have access to Wi-Fi internet, you want to be on the lookout and helping those students to be successful in the virtual environment. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, here are some sample platforms. I'm not advocating for any one of these particular platforms. I just wanted to give some examples. In the resource section, there is an online resource where you can compare. There's dozens of virtual platforms as well as their level of security. So you can compare all of those features across each platform. It looks like a really great tool, highly recommend it. And you also want to consider, again, that business associate agreement to really ensure your students' security and protection and privacies. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. I'm done for now.
Great. All right, let me turn it over to Sue Coyle.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So now that Tim's given us all the ins and outs about new ways of providing services virtually to students, let's just talk about some of our most vulnerable students. Some of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that just like we expect and train our staff to keep an eye out on potential students that might be struggling with mental health issues or struggling with suicidal ideation, we want to remind staff that even though they may be teaching, they still need to be mindful of those things and remembering what those warning signs may be, and inform them explicitly on, in this new setting, how to report those concerns and how to get, who are the go-to people for that. Another important piece is check-ins and monitoring. So if you formally had students before schools went virtual that were newly coming out of hospitalization or in treatment, and you had some kind of a support plan for them, make sure that you're continuing those check-ins and monitoring and support plans, and that you've adapted them to this new setting. And that could include scheduling check-ins with parents and teachers, and I highly recommend that. And also, if possible, if you've been communicating with outside providers that were providing services for your students, continue that. And if you haven't, you might want to, if you do have a student that's getting outside services, perhaps getting releases so that you can start that kind of a conversation about how a private mental health provider might partner with the school in, providing services and supporting the student. Also, as important is to inform teachers when you are monitoring a student, just as you would in a brick and mortar environment. You want to make sure that teachers know that you're continuing to work with that student and collaborate with them about ways to support their unique needs in this new virtual environment. And then, as always, continue to provide referrals for outside help. If you do find that a student is struggling and is newly identified. So one tool here, and David always reminds me to provide a disclaimer here that before you use any kind of an app, make sure that it's approved by your district. But if you are working with a student, just as you would create safety plans for them in school, I recommend working with them virtually to create a safety plan. And this is just an example of one tool you could use. It's called the My3 Safety Plan app. So thinking about suicide and risk assessments, I'm just going to go over this briefly because Tim talked about this in great detail, but it is important to review and adjust your assessment protocols with your team and administration. There are handouts in your Dropbox folder with templates for checklists and flowcharts for assessment and some other tools that I highly recommend you work on with your team and administration to look at those and how you can adapt them for this virtual environment and that the virtual environment specific to your school. And making sure, again, informing staff how to report when a student may be maybe at risk for suicide. Make sure that all staff still understand that and are keeping an eye out on kids. And also, one last thing, I recommend wherever you are in New Jersey, whether you're Central Jersey, our crisis center would be through Rutgers University Behavioral Health Care, acute psychiatric services would be our go-to place for assessments. I have spoken with folks there and know that they have plans for providing virtual assessments. So it would be a good idea to find out what is going on in your catchment area and how you can, so that you know how to facilitate any kind of an evaluation that might be needed. In anticipation of this webinar, it made me question what kind of services are being done that are some of the tools and referral sources that school counselors normally look to, such as mobile response, perform care, and DCP&P in various situations. I was happy to talk with them and to see that they have very detailed protocols and ways to assess there even may be some in-person things going on out there. Mostly things are being assessed so that the majority of services are being conducted virtually, but know that those folks are out there still doing that work. Okay. Another important area to consider is if you are in charge of overseeing 504 plans, or as individual counselors, you have students with 504 plans, just take a look over those and review them, because there may be some accommodation needs for an at-home setting that are different than what would have happened in a brick and mortar school. So the way to do that would be to check in with parents and students, reassure them that you're still keeping an eye out for their unique needs based on the fact that they do qualify for 504 accommodations, and ask about those needs. One example of that I came across in talking with a parent is a student that has OCD and has very severe problems with disruption and with focus. And because there were little kids in the family during the time of day when this high schooler was trying to do school, they were unable to focus. So the parent needed to talk with the school about finding some alternate times when the student could be doing their work. So whatever those needs may be, it's important to reach out to parents to find out what they are. So Tim talked a bit about revisiting crisis protocols. I'm here to represent our New Jersey Traumatic Loss Coalitions for Youth and give you a quick overview for those of you who are not familiar with our services, and then let you know what we're doing for schools now in this new virtual environment. So we promote best practices in suicide prevention and trauma understanding, and have always reached out and helped schools and other organizations that have experienced a loss in the community. Okay, David. Every county has a coordinator, a coalition, which is comprised of many various people from the communities, mostly mental health providers and school folks. And importantly to know, we have a lead crisis response team, which is comprised of people that are trained in doing trauma response, specifically in a school setting. We also have a statewide coordinator and a central team that plans and provides training and technical assistance for county coordinators so that we can do the good work of supporting all of you. And the number is right down there for you. Also know that in your Dropbox folder, there's more information about and a list of all of the various county coordinators and their contact information, because they're still there for you. Okay, David? So what we're going to be doing, how TLC is still going to continue to provide trauma response during a pandemic. We are here to provide consultation to schools. Especially at this time, schools have been reaching out to us and asking for help and how to readjust their crisis plans and protocols for this new virtual setting. When there is a loss in a school that impacts the loss of someone in the school community, we assist in assessing the needs and developing a plan for support for that school community. We can help with assisting in drafting notifications and communications, provide resources for staff and parents. I'll give you some of those resources a little later. We assist in creating a plan so that we can still continue to provide psychological first aid to members of the school community. So lead crisis responders will be able to co-facilitate that psychological first aid with school personnel through the school's virtual communication system. So we will make contact with the school and your contact person and use whatever your system is and partner with them to provide those kind of virtual resources to students and staff. Okay, David.
So I know that we've given you a tremendous amount of information here. We just want to pause for a moment, Rebecca, to see if we have questions.
We have a tremendous amount of questions.
Yes.
I think the most important thing is if you can please repeat where the PowerPoint would be posted with the
Sure.
audio. We had a very small amount of people who could not hear, maybe about 5. And more importantly, where is everything going to be posted? And then we have some quickie questions.
So quickly, first, we are going to directly email everyone who registered for this webinar by tomorrow with a link to the audio recording. You'll be able to see it, and a link to the PowerPoint, which embeds links to all of the resources. And this will also be posted on the NJPSA website. We do have a section of our website for our webinars, the free webinars that we have been providing. So if you go to our homepage, you will see an area designated that shows the online webinars that we have been providing. So it'll be on the website, but we will affirmatively send it out to everybody who is signed up by tomorrow.
Then we have another question. What is the due diligence that would have to be shown if you try to reach parents and after quite a number of calls or emails, they don't respond? And as we know, a lot of our parents have just picked up and moved with their families to safer places, or families, other parts of the family. So what is due diligence so you've reached out?
A couple things. You want to go through the emergency response list, and there should be a number of other contacts as well besides the direct parent or guardian. Exhaust that list. You probably want to contact local law enforcement and make them aware that you have been trying to reach this family and they are unreachable, and document that contact as well once you've exhausted the emergency contact list. If there are other friends of that family who might have some information, you may want to try to brainstorm that as well, if there's other folks who could point you in the right direction.
Excellent. We know that some of the parks are closed down in the inner cities in most areas. Is there any list of resources of what kids can do to either get out or just to do something meaningful because the parks are closed?
That's a good question. And of course, I would be surprised at this point to find a list that the state has put out, because obviously we are actively discouraging group gatherings of any sort. So I'm not sure that such a list exists. And the latest CDC guidance does also talk about, if we are going outside, having a mask covering. Finding ways to do solo exercise outside, running but not near or around others could be very useful. We just have to be aware of the social distancing piece and the new guidelines coming out on wearing masks even at any point in time when we're outside.
David, in the Dropbox will be a resource from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that has a very large list of age-appropriate suggestions for activities that kids can be doing while social distancing.
Excellent.
Excellent, thank you. And we had quite a number of thank yous for sharing all these great resources.
Wonderful. So I do want to mention some of the resources that we have out there. One is well, first let me tell you about a series of free webinars that we're going to be doing that builds on a number of the points that we discussed today. We have partnered with New Jersey PTA, and anything you can do to help get the word out to your parents about these free sessions would be wonderful. So we're going to have one on April 14th on addressing the social and emotional well-being of the whole family. One on April 23rd, meeting the needs of students with disabilities, and one on April 28th, using social media responsibly to engage your kids. And in the PowerPoint that you'll all receive, we do have active links for folks who want to sign up for any of the workshops in that series that we are, again, co-sponsoring with New Jersey PTA. Sue, this was, I think, an important resource that you had identified for us.
I've gotten many requests from our coalition partners, and and schools in my county, which is Middlesex, for resources in order to support families that are beginning to experience loss. So this toolkit from an organization called Good Grief, you can click on there and download the PDF. It has, I've already referred several families to it that have found it very helpful. And Good Grief also has really responded to the needs of parents and kids and families by creating webinars and podcasts with lots of good information about how to manage through this time. Another organization that is providing virtual free grief counseling for kids and families is Imagine. And then I've also placed additional grief handouts that you can be sharing with parents with information in the Dropbox folder.
So a programmatic note, we're going to go a few minutes over today. I do want to make sure that folks understand all the great resources that we have made available for you. So we're going to go a few extra minutes, but why don't you share this one as well, Sue?
Okay, so the Child Mind Institute is an excellent resource that has resources for both parents and educators around all kinds of mental health issues, but they've created many resources now with like very specific things. For instance, managing through anxiety during pandemic, and various different types of resources on how to talk with kids at different developmental ages, and then things about specific mental health issues during this time of pandemic. So I would highly recommend clicking on there and exploring that. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network I already mentioned, but they also have additional great resources besides just the activities list. And then Tim has already touted the American School Counselor Association. But I also wanted to mention the National Association of School Psychologists has excellent handouts that can be provided to parents with guidance around grief and around dealing with pandemic. They also have many of them in multiple different languages, which is another need that I've been finding folks in my county have needed. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network also has handouts in Spanish as well, and as does the Child Mind Institute. So if you're looking for something for your Spanish-speaking parents, that's the place to go.
Tim, I know you had identified some additional resources.
Yeah, just a few. So I like to hyperlink and give as much to walk away with, because there's plenty from this webinar that we're trying to cram in a very short window of time to give all of you as much information as possible. So the Ask Ethical Standards is available through that particular link. Telebehavioral Health Center of Excellence, National Consortium of Telehealth Resource Center. Those are some nice informational sources if you're interested in more about telemental health. The telemental health comparisons is the one I mentioned earlier about comparing different providers and their level of compliance in different areas. So you can look at the different components and settings and say, which ones do I really want to consider for my district based on how secure they really are. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is it's a resource. I won't say I can recommend it. It's considered the standard, so to speak, but if you're looking for some sort of refresher training or some sort of a protocol that you can consider to use in your districts in a virtual environment, that might be one. New Jersey Mental Health Resources for Parents is something that I'm working on developing with the NJPSA and the state PTA, some mental health resources that you can utilize to refer your students and parents to. And the last one is from the Ask a website, and it's really frequently asked questions on virtual school environments. It even has a protocol or a recommended protocol to follow in the event of a crisis situation. So lots of great resources.
And some great groups here too, as well, right, Tim?
Yes, definitely. Dr. Kara out of Rowan University and former NJSCA President Jen Grimaldi started the elementary, middle, and high school groups that you can see here. They meet on those respective days, and those are the Zoom links to connect to them. It is an open invitation for anybody that's looking to connect, share, or gain resources for those respective levels. I've also started an in-kind state director supervisor group that's only been out there for about a week or two. We thankfully have hit the issue of having more people than I can accommodate on my free account. So more information will be forthcoming on that link for that. If you are a supervisor, director of school counseling and are interested in joining, if you're not already getting the emails, please reach out to me directly. My contact information is, there you go. Thank you, Dave. Perfect.
That's right. So I do want to say each of our presenters has been incredibly generous, and I didn't put this slide up lightly, but they did all agree that we could share individual contact information for those who might want some follow-up to our presentation today. I want to thank all of our incredible presenters for the wonderful information that you've put out there, for taking the time to work with us on this. Thank everybody out there in the field for the great work you're doing to support our students. We appreciate your efforts and how you've all gone above and beyond, and we want to be there for you as well to support you. For those interested in more information regarding Legal One, we have given you that link as well. And for those who are interested in other webinars, unfortunately, we are in a time where in-person training is not currently possible. So we want you to be aware of other webinars that we have made available for those in the field. With that, thank you everybody for being part of this session. Thank you for your patience. It's taking us a little extra because we wanted to make sure you had all of the information that we can give you about these incredible resources. So thank you for my co-presenters, and we look forward to providing ongoing support for everyone in the field and doing everything we can to help you to help our children.